Okay. All right, y'all. Is this thing on? Hello. Testing the microphone. So if I stand here, will it be able to pick up on it?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay, so today we're going to be looking at Revelation 12 to 14 in our study. Last week we ended with peals of thunder and flashes of lightning. And we're going to go right into a great portent. So chapter 12 begins with kind of the sign appearing. And it's a kind of a bit of a retelling of nativity, but in a sort of a different context. This is actually one of my favorite chapters in Revelation. It's very epic, and it's kind of telling this pretty age-old story about a woman and a dragon. And so, you know, in chapter, Chapter 11, we see, it says, the nations raged, which reminds me of Psalm 2, and then we actually see a quote from Psalm 2 here in a minute that we'll read here in a second. And so this is one of those sections of the Bible where I know that y'all have looked at a little bit of art already, but this is one of those sections of the Bible that there's a ton of art on. And so as you see, William Blake, if you've ever seen Red Dragon, this is one of those that he has like 4 or 5 paintings just on chapters 12 through 14 of the book of Revelation. And so this is supposed to be that great red dragon that we're going to be reading about. And so this woman that we see is a little bit of a beginning in Revelation of a series of very powerful female figures. And so, or feminine figures, I should say. And so John kind of positions the coming of Jesus, the coming of the Messiah, within a very cosmic context. And so when you see, the nativities maybe in Matthew or Luke, with shepherds and a manger, John envisions a great dragon and a woman who is pregnant. And so we're going to go ahead and read chapter 12. Also in this, you'll find, well, this is kind of all through Revelation, but time is a little bit funny, so time kind of comes and goes. And I was thinking this past week about how my brain doesn't really understand what it means to be outside of time. And so I'm trying, as I read this, I'm always trying to place this, oh, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened in history. And for something to be a cosmic picture of something that is happening is very kind of confusing to me. So just keep that in mind as we read. So we're going to go ahead and read chapter 12. Does anybody want to read?
I'll read it.
Yeah, whoever said that? Donna? Okay, go ahead.
The woman and the dragon. A great portent appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pangs, in the agony of giving birth. Then another portent appeared in heaven, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on his head. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. Then the dragon stood before the woman who was about to bear a child, so that he might devour her child as soon as it was born. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was snatched away and taken to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she can be nourished for 1,260 days. Michael defeats the dragon. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven proclaiming, "Now have come the salvation of the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our comrades has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. But they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. For they did not cling to life, even in the face of death. Rejoice then, you heavens, and those who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you with great wrath, because he knows that his time is short." So when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she could fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to her place where she is nourished for a time, and times, and half a time. Then from his mouth the serpent poured water like a river after the woman, to sweep her away with the flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman. It opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. Then the dragon was angry with the woman, and went off to make war on the rest of her children, those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus.
All right. So we get this woman and the dragon. There's war in heaven. And what happens to the dragon? The dragon is unceremoniously kicked out of heaven and is thrown down to the earth with a third of the stars, which we kind of assume is something. What stands out to you in this chapter? I like this depiction of Michael here on the right, which is a Japanese version. You sometimes see Michael a lot with him slaying the dragon. What stands out to you in this chapter?
Well, obviously, like, I'm going to eat your offspring.
Yeah.
That's pretty hard.
He's waiting over a pregnant woman who is, about to give birth, is a very vulnerable position to be in. And so he's hovering, he's crouched over her, ready to devour her child. Who is this woman? Who is the woman? I like this depiction of her.
Is she Mary?
A lot of times Mary is shown like in the way that this is described, with a moon with stars at her head. Typically, this woman is conceived of as the people of God, through like the Israelites and God's, the people who have produced this Messiah, essentially. And so the people of God throughout all of history, again, think of something that is outside of time, is what this picture is trying to convey. And so you see this woman, and she is in the pangs of childbirth. And I think of the prophets sometimes, that they're foretelling this Messiah that is supposed to be coming, and they're experiencing violence, and they have not yet experienced the coming of the Messiah, and they're waiting. Also in Ezekiel and Isaiah kind of talks about this dragon a little bit. And so, this woman is, sometimes there's when you read this, I kind of get a picture of Mary a little bit, but Mary was not as thematically relevant to the church at the time that this was being written as maybe she would be later on in church history. Anything else that you find interesting about this chapter?
I find it striking towards the end of the chapter, just the agency that the earth has in all of this.
Yes.
It's not people who are coming to her rescue, it's the earth itself. The created order is rising up.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, because oftentimes you think of the earth as being separate from the heavens, in that like earth is like worldly and like very sinful. But even the earth is inhospitable to the dragon, and the earth actually nourishes the woman and protects this woman. And whenever the dragon is trying to attack her, it protects her. And you see that the dragon is not really at home anywhere in this story. And so you see, we'll see in a minute that, he has to get help, essentially. Oh, I think I lost my spot. What else? What other symbols? There's a lot of symbols in this.
The number of days that the woman is to be protected.
Yeah.
Like time and time.
Yeah, so like, what does the time mean again? And
1,260 days.
yeah, so and some of those, I think, what chapter is that? Sorry, or what verse is that? Oh, 1,260 days. So yeah, it's like the time, times and times and a half. That for a long period of time, essentially, that this woman is being cared for. She's taken away. God has prepared a place for her, which is something that we see, that God has prepared a place for his people, and that God knows when the coming of the Messiah is going to be. And so whenever the dragon lashes out at her, it seems as though both the heavens and the earth are able to provide a place. And then you see this loud voice in heaven: now has come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God, because the accuser of our comrades has been thrown out, the one who accuses them. And so you'll remember that that's what Satan means, right? That is, Satan is the accuser, the adversary. And so the serpent like pours forth this water, and the earth, I like what Anna said, the earth came to help the woman. And so not only is the dragon going to make war with the woman, but it ends with the dragon making war with all of her offspring. All right. So a little bit, well, we'll get to that in a minute. So how is the dragon defeated in this picture? In this, like, this painting almost, I think of it as a painting. How is the dragon defeated in this? Oh, yes. So he is not quite defeated in chapter 12. And so in the next little portion that we're going to look at, he stands on the sand of the seashore, right?
The angels fought against the dragon.
Yeah, so we have this picture of cosmic forces kind of coming together and fighting against one another. So it's not just Michael. Michael is the kind of the commander, the ruler of the angelic armies, right? That's what hosts means. And so Satan, the accuser, is clashing forces with Michael. And this verse in this proclamation, essentially the preaching, that they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they did not cling to life, even in the face of death. And so this whole section is this proclamation to the people of God who are suffering, and who you'll see in the next chapter that John wants to give them a piece of his hope in what has happened to this dragon, what has happened to this adversary. Do y'all have any other thoughts about, what other questions about this? Any other thoughts before we? Nope? Okay. the next section, you'll see we've come to a little bit of the symbols that we've talked about in the past. And so we'll come to a few of these because, as you know, some of these numbers will come up, and especially the multipliers. And so it was very common to use these sort of things. To us, it seems a little bit more mysterious to us, but this was pretty normal for them. And so we're going to go ahead and read most of chapter 13. And is there anybody that would like to read chapter 13?
I'll read it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Then the dragon took a stand on the sand of the seashore. And I saw a beast rising out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads. And on its horns were 10 diadems, and on its heads were blasphemous names. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And the dragon gave it his power, and his throne, and great authority. One of its heads seemed to have received a death blow, but its mortal wound had been healed. In amazement, the whole earth followed the beast. They worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it?" The beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. Also it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. It was given authority over every tribe and people and language and nation, and all the inhabitants of the earth will worship it, everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb that was slaughtered. Let anyone who has an ear listen. If you are to be taken captive, into captivity you go. If you kill with the sword you must be killed. Here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. Should we keep going?
Yeah, actually just read the next.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then I saw another beast that rose out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast on its behalf, and it makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound had been healed. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in the sight of all. And by the signs that it is allowed to perform on behalf of the beast, it deceives the inhabitants of earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that had been wounded by the sword, and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast could even speak, and cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Also it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell who does not have the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a person. Its number is 666.
If we had any sound effects during this reading, I think we should do like the shung shung of like Law and Order, or like a very like you know, like that's what I imagine during this reading. This is one of those parts of the Bible, you know, that we have a lot of fun with, and I say that sort of tongue-in-cheek, obviously. This is one of those that is talked about a lot. And so the first thing that I want to point out is that, actually, I'm just going to move this like a little bit. The first thing for this, so we see the dragon again, and the dragon is kicked out of heaven, and then the dragon cannot find a really hospitable place on earth, and so it needs help. It's trying to recruit help from anywhere that it can find it. And this dragon is going to get help from both the land and the sea. There's these beasts that we're talking about. And actually, the youth have been going through a little bit into the book of Daniel, and so I may talk a little bit about the book of Daniel, because there's a lot of overlap here from the book of Daniel and some of the apocalyptic passages in chapter 7. And so you see the dragon took his stand. He takes a stand on the sand of the seashore. And you see a beast coming up out of the sea. It has 10 horns and 10 heads. And on its horns were 10 diadems or crowns. And anytime you see a crown, that is probably a sign that we're talking about something political. Okay, so this is not a crown like when Paul talks about, I will receive the crown of life, like an athlete would get a laurel wreath. That's a different kind of crown. This is talking about a crown, a diadem of ruling, a rulership, something that John is telling us, he's notifying us that he's talking about something political here. These are 10 diadems, and on its head were blasphemous names. Now, in the book of Daniel has these visions. The two places in the Bible where there's apocalyptic visions, there's a lot of overlap here. So in chapter 7 of Daniel, he sees a beast that is a leopard. And then he sees another beast that is a lion, and another beast that is a bear. And it actually tells you, like, Daniel's not very shy about telling you what's going on. He's like, oh yeah, these are empires. Like he interprets almost all of the dreams that he has. And so he's like, these 3 beasts, and actually one that comes after it, which he doesn't liken to an animal, but it has teeth that devours its victims in its teeth. And so there's these 4 creatures, the leopard, the bear, the lion, and then this other one with ferocious teeth that come and wreak havoc on the earth and God's people specifically. And so, and then Daniel says, the Ancient of Days comes and opens up a book, and he sits down on his throne, and he establishes a kingdom that will never end. And so Daniel tells us that these are specific empires. This is like the Medes, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans, right? And so John comes in chapter 13, and we see this beast come out of the land. And then you see another beast that comes out of the sea. I guess that's reversed. One comes out of the sea and one comes out of the land, right? And the same as in Daniel, they are uttering blasphemous names. They speak very boastfully. This is a theme actually in Daniel that the things that are against God are speaking boastfully and pridefully. They're raising themselves up against the image of God, right? And so in Daniel, this is a really big theme. You actually see Nebuchadnezzar become like an animal for like 40 days or something. It's one of the themes that you see, that the kings of the earth have become beastly creatures, that these empires are becoming beastly because they have turned their backs on God. And so these beasts that we see in Revelation are these empires that have been corrupted by the dragon. And they are ones that have turned their backs and have actually forsaken their identity as what God has called them to be, right? And so they've become these sort of creatures that are not humanly, they're beastly. So, not just that, but there's also this image of there's this kind of false trinity that we have going on in this chapter. There's this series of 3, there's this series of 6, the dragon, the beast from the sea, and the beast on the land. They do what is opposite of what God does, which is creation. They are against creation. They are anti-creation. So whenever they do things, it's opposite of the will of God. And so these political powers, whatever it is, that are being influenced by the dragon are going against what God is doing in his kingdom. And you actually see this is maybe strange language, but you see this in Jesus. Jesus talks about this, that he's saying, actually, this is what the kingdom of God is like, right? So the kingdom of God, when Jesus came, is not what people expected. And it's the opposite of what we often experience, the way that humans do things, right? So the last will be first and the first will be last. And a little child will lead them, that sort of thing. And so in the ways that the beast out of the sea and the beast on the land use violence and coercion and deception, that's what the beast on the earth uses, deception. It looks like it's a lamb that had been slain, but it speaks like a dragon. It uses deception. Go ahead.
I noticed the fact that God isn't fighting the dragon directly, right? It's using Michael and the angels or other things.
Right. Yeah. Well, and yeah, exactly. So like God does have these spiritual forces, right? And I think that's actually pretty fascinating, at least to me, that God actually does have these spiritual forces all over the earth in a way that we don't fully understand. And I think that Revelation gives us an amazing picture of what some of the more mundane things in life are like on a spiritual plane. Growing up, this was a very strange thing to me, but I think this is actually a comforting thing to me now, that God does have powers in the world, and that God's power, as you see in chapter 12, that God's power actually triumphs over all these others. And God's power is not the same as human coercion or human force or human violence in the way that we're used to it, right?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
We go through and read scriptures, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and so forth, and we're taught that, from the sermons and so forth, they talk basically about the spiritual growth. How in the world was this ever used? I mean, can you explain to me
Yeah.
how you would teach that to a congregation?
Well, I'm trying to do that right now.
We're not here
No, it's okay.
to learn what we should do and how we should live. This is way beyond.
Yeah, that's a good question. How would this have been received by John's audience? Like, how would this have helped them, right?
Exactly.
And for me, maybe this is just a personal thing, but if God tells me, or really anything, if something is being named for what it is, that actually helps me to understand what I'm up against. And so whenever I see, if I'm a Roman or a Jew living in the Roman world, or somebody who has become a Christian, I was a Gentile, became a Christian, and I'm living under an empire that is murderous and violent, and God is telling me, these are the powers of the dragon that are coming up against the people of God, that actually helps me. And this image of Michael and the image of who Christ is in this picture, especially in chapter 12, of who Christ is, that Jesus is doing something. Jesus coming to earth is doing something that has been going on for a long time before I came and will go on after I am gone. And so, John actually says here is a call for endurance and faith of the saints. And you see kind of he says it again in the next chapter. This calls for great discernment among the saints. So he's calling them to endure and have faith. He's encouraging them to keep the faith. You're up against these powers of the dragon, these like beasts, these beastly powers that rule in a way that I'm not calling you to rule, but it's tempting to use coercion, and it's tempting to use violence, and it's tempting to use the powers in the way that the empire uses the power. But God has called you to something else, because the lamb that we saw in chapter 5, the lamb that has been slain, is the one who conquers. And it's by the blood of the lamb and the word of their testimony is the way that the people of God conquer, instead of using the power that is around them. That's how I imagine things. Does anybody have any good ways of imagining this? Go ahead, Anna.
I was just gonna say, I think there's something else helpful here. I don't know, maybe it's just the tradition I was raised in, but sometimes the way, Jesus ascended to heaven and we're just here left behind, whatever. Sometimes it can seem like, oh, well, God's just up in heaven twiddling his fingers and building a house for us. But what this tells us is that God is not inactive, that while we are battling things here on earth, there is also a spiritual war being waged on our behalf, and that God is very actively fighting back against the very things that we experience in a different way. We're not watching dragons and angels fighting in the skies, but that there is a spiritual battle going on, and that God is fighting with us on a different plane, that we're not alone in this battle, and that God is not idle outside of this little room here, that there's things going on outside of it.
Yeah, and also to say that this isn't really, it is our battle, but it's our battle because it's God's battle, in the same way that we work alongside Christ, but he is the master gardener sort of situation. Christ calls us co-laborers with him, but we didn't start the work, and I'm not going to end the work, that's for sure, but we're working alongside Christ. I think of that picture when I think of this battle, because it's ultimately the battle that God is doing and God is waging. God is at least fighting, and God will ultimately win. And so I have come into that story. Donna?
It's easy to fast forward to today, where there's not a single entity on earth that doesn't have some culpability in relation to this.
Absolutely.
We often think, oh, we're the good guys.
But Donna, we are the good guys. Aren't we the good guys? Well, and I think that you are hitting on something very important, because when I read about, especially the second beast here, you hear, it talks about this mark, right? Which is probably not a literal mark. Nobody's talking about a literal mark here. These are pictures, right? These are symbols. But I think Donna is onto something about everybody being a little bit culpable, because there's a reason why it talks about deception here. And that's because it's really easy to be deceived. It's really easy. And I think that happens on a very mundane level. It happens on a more mundane level than you think. None of this seems very mundane, but this is talking about everyday life. This is just talking about politics and the world you live in and the money that you spend and the people that rule your cities and your nations and the world. And that's actually very mundane. And so we get caught in it, right? And I get caught in it. And the point is not that we are exempt, or we're the holy righteous who have never done anything or never got caught in a snare. That's really not the point of this, but it is John telling us, actually, you can discern what the dragon is doing and endure, keep the faith. Go ahead.
But do you suppose you could take sections of this and develop a sermon where you're going to talk defiantly about the Roman Empire in the presence of Satan? Because this symbology hides the fact that the churches, Christians, are talking about the Roman Empire, because that's the first thing would happen if you jumped up.
Yeah, and I hope I haven't said that yet, but yeah, this is definitely about the Roman Empire.
I mean, you didn't say it, but we know.
Well, yeah, and we're talking. It's fine.
I'm just saying that during that time, if you want to be persecuted
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And they'll make you a torch in the city streets,
Right.
light you on fire. And
I'm just trying to get a better handle on what all this is supposed to be.
yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, yeah, so this is largely about the Roman Empire, and I think maybe I jumped ahead to making it about everybody, but yeah, so if you were reading this, and John's people who are reading this, whoever he was writing to initially, they would have immediately thought, oh yeah, this is about the Roman Empire, obviously. That was the world they were living in. 10 horns, the Decapolis, the 10 hills of Rome. It's not hard to make the connections there that, especially like the beasts of Daniel, it's kind of culminating into this amalgamation, this very strange beast that's like kind of piecemealed together of all these different beasts. And so it kind of represents this huge force as such as, the world had never seen before. And, a lot of people even talk about Nero in this passage. There's kind of the rumor that he killed himself by stabbing himself in the head or in the neck or something. And there was a rumor that he was alive after that. And so this deathly blow, this mortal wound to the head had been healed that you see in this passage. It's perhaps a symbol of Nero. Also the symbology of the 666. As you know, like the multipliers plus 6 meaning like profane, everything that is not quite perfect. Go ahead.
If 6 is profane, does it mean that because the 3 of them is also like spiritually profane?
It means like super, super, super profane. Yeah.
That one digit above that is sacred, perfect,
Right. Yeah, so it falls short, right? So it falls short of perfection and has become something that is twisted, which is essentially what evil is, right?
Do we know approximately when the material that's in Revelation was written down?
I think so, but I do not. Do you know? I don't have the things on me. I should have had this. Yeah, I don't have that.
The mid-90s, most people think. We don't know. They didn't date it. But most
Yeah.
people assume it was around 90, 96, somewhere around there. When this was written? Is that what you're
Yeah.
asking?
Well, no, actually, yes.
Right.
And okay. I love timelines. And
Oh, yeah.
Does not have one.
I know, it doesn't. It's confusing. All right, I'm actually gonna move on because we have like just a minute left, and I want to get. We won't be able to talk a whole lot about this, but you actually see in chapter 14 this vision of the new Jerusalem, or of Mount Zion coming down, which is kind of an interlude where there's worship, and we get a reminder of what all of this is essentially about. And then in chapter 14, I'm not going to read the whole thing. I wanted to read 6 to 13, but I'm going to go ahead and real quick read starting in chapter 14. It says, "Then I looked, and there was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like the Son of Man, with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to the one who sat on the cloud, 'Use your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is fully ripe.' So the one who sat on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was reaped. Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven." Previously there were 3 angels. That's what that's about. "Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Then another angel came out of the altar, the angel who had authority over fire, and he called with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, 'Use your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of the vines of the earth. For its grapes are ripe.' So the angel swung his sickle over the earth and gathered the vintage of the earth, and he threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle, for a distance of about 200 miles. All right. So again, actually here, this is a similar image in Daniel 7. You see the Ancient of Days in Daniel 7 comes and sits, and you see a man like a son of, in Daniel he says, I saw one like a son of man on a white cloud. And this son of man is the one who opens the book and judges the nations. And judge also being, the reflection of a just God. Is there anything that stands out to y'all about this short section that I read? Anything? We're talking about wrath a little bit here. Sometimes that makes us feel, Anna.
I'm trying to find it, but I remember early on in Revelation, like we're painted this picture of, basically there's still access to super wealthy things like wine and there's abundance for people who have privilege and access, but there's like no bread for people starving in the streets.
Oh.
But here we finally have like everything is leveled. All the fancy stuff, the caviar is
Completely
gone.
leveled, yes.
Total, like now everyone is in the same boat. There's no longer the stratification of
Right.
access. Like the bougie stuff is gone as well. And so like we're finally getting just full.
Yeah. This is judgment, right? So Anna is talking about everything being leveled. And I think of level as in like, when I hear that, I think of like a nuclear disaster, like it levels the land, but leveling, that's what justice is, right? It's a leveling of the scales. And so we are talking about justice here. That's what God's wrath is about. And if you think of throughout the Bible, you see times where it talks about how people's, maybe a group of people, their sin has not quite been built up enough, and so their cup of iniquity, if you heard that term, the cup of iniquity is not quite full yet, and so God has patience. A lot of times in 2 Peter and also in Romans talks about how God doesn't want anybody to perish. He has patience on people in their sin, and that's why he doesn't always punish people who have been sinful or punish nations who have been sinful yet until their cup of iniquity has been full. But you also see this in the garden with Jesus, right? We see Jesus drink this cup of wrath to the dregs, and he is a little bit nervous about what this means. He's, sweating blood in the garden about what this is talking about, this like reaping. And so you actually see the picture of Jesus as the gardener. You see Jesus as the vine dresser. Jesus as the one who's the sower of the seed. And now we see Jesus as the harvester, the one who comes, which is oftentimes an image of joy, harvest. But this is one of those, a picture that John is telling us about God. Does anybody have any other thoughts on this before we have to go? Any other thoughts?
I'm speechless.
Surely not. Well, unless there's any more questions, I'm going to say a prayer for us, especially in this interesting passage that we just read. And I hope that it does encourage you. I hope that, these are like pretty strange pictures. But I think one thing that this would mean for people who are reading it is that God is working, like Anna said, that God actually hasn't just left us here to our own devices. And God has not left us alone.
I don't think Revelation should be read in continuity, like 1
Oh.
to 2 to 3. It's too many.
Actually, I was thinking, which may be against what you're saying, I don't know, but what I was thinking is that sometimes the chapter breaks are more confusing than if you just read it straight. Sometimes I think we should just read it straight through, because the chapter breaks can kind of make it sound like there's a break in the story. You know? Do you think?
Until what, 12th century or something?
Yeah. Thanks, Donna. Anyway, okay. Well, I'm going to pray for us. Let's pray, y'all. Dear Lord, thank you for this book that you've given us. I pray that you would remind us of your comfort. Thank you for being with us and fighting for us and loving us, and that you have not left us alone. In Jesus' name, amen. All right.